The first thing is always the mandatory, make sure your phones are off. And I'm usually the one who's guilty of not turning it off, but I've done it. I have the pleasure to present to you this event, Beyond Conflict and War, Civilian and Military Perspectives. And first of all, I want to just welcome you for coming. My heart always sinks when somebody says that I'll be brief, but I will try and be brief. Thanks, there are a lot of thanks here. Poets and Writers, New York State Council of the Arts for funding. Ruth Dannon, Beacon and Dutchess County Poet Laureate for invaluable input and extending me a generous personal and professional welcome to Beacon a few years back. Mitch Corrado for co-organizing and putting together the flyer and program, figuring out how to put together a flyer and a program. Kristen Coulter for her wonderful piece on the event, which earned us the front page of the latest issue of Beacon Free Press. And by the way, out where you came in, I say the front door, the back door, which is the front door for now, there's a bunch of books in the newspaper, so you can have a look at some of the authors' books and the newspaper article here. Denise Doring Van Buren, President of Beacon Historical Society, for hosting us here, which means no bad behavior unless you don't mind it being added to the historical archives. Pete Skorowitz for videography, another reason not to misbehave. Councilwoman Molly Rhodes, Cornell Green for Out of Bounds Graphics, Harold Delameter, and I am going to apologize if I'm mispronouncing some of the names, Harold Delameter, Commander of VFW, Keith Cultis, Commander of American Legion, Post 203, Tony Pulliam, Commander of Marine Corps League, Carmen Ramputi Detachment, and to all of you for coming out on a Sunday to hear what is a literary reading with a twist. A somewhat odd beast in several ways. There was some synchronicity benefiting this event because my idea for having an event like this turned out to intersect with the VFW plans for events tackling the civilian-military divide, which of course is a very important issue at this current time especially. So our readers may touch on this issue directly, indirectly, maybe not at all, and perhaps as part of personal accounts or viewpoint. I, at any rate, am interested to hear from that perspective. So authors and speakers will present their own and others' writing side by side, and it is quite an extraordinarily varied roundup of readers that we have here today, unusual. We'll be reading a variety of different writing genres, so fiction, non-fiction, poetry, all around the event, the civilian-military focus. This mixture of ingredients, cross-arts and cross-disciplinary themes is something that I've been doing my whole life as a freelance writer. Taking literature and not having it be this separate entity, but integrated with society and aspects of society. And I think at least one of our readers, Malia, probably is familiar with this kind of work. And in fact, this is the first event for a group called Writing Out of Bounds, which I hope is going to continue to have similar cross-arts, cross-disciplinary events, perhaps more like this, also in other areas, but in a similar spirit. And in the new year, you might want to look out for an event around the topic of the natural world and environmentalism, featuring some leading naturalist writers. I'm going to end this, not in the least bit brief introduction, by saying, look at the table there for some examples of books by the authors and the newspaper. And I'm also going to say that instead of doing biographies as we go, because you have full biographies in the program, that each reader will just introduce the next reader after that. And we may or may not have an intermission. We're going to see how it goes. We may just plow on through. And I just want to hand over for a little bit more of the introduction to Mitch Corrado, who's going to say a few words. Unlike me, he will probably be brief. So welcome Mitch Corrado to the front.
Thank you all. This comes as somewhat as a surprise to me. I was not expecting to speak, mostly because I just handled the logistics for writing out of bounds. All the content is actually in Eva's hands. But when Eva first conceived the idea for this event, I happened to mention something to her in passing, which she then asked me to relate to you, because it seemed to intersect so well with what we're trying to accomplish here today. Just by way of context, I am a retired Army non-commissioned officer, 25 years as a tanker and a scout team leader. 3 of those years were spent in Iraq. But what I told Eva was this. My last commander, probably the best and most effective one I've ever had in those 25 years, used to require of his troop leadership in our cavalry squadron that we give book reports whenever we had our quarterly combined staff meetings. When it was our troops' turn, I chose Stephen Pressfield's Gates of Fire, which is a novel. It's a novel of the Battle of Thermopylae, and if that name doesn't ring any immediate bells, you probably recognize it better as the story of the 300 Spartans. So, using this novel, we were able to springboard off that and do Army talk. There was the topics of terrain analysis, there's principles of reconnaissance, logistics, and supply. But we wanted to say more than that. And since we had chosen a novel, I felt it was incumbent on us to explain why we chose a work of fiction over a more academic treatise. And the reasons were kind of threefold. To begin with, there are only 2 survivors from the Spartans in that battle, and they weren't there at the final assault. Secondly, Herodotus is normally considered the most contemporary source for the battle, but he's written 70 years after. So we're not talking about an awful lot of primary source material here. But the primary reason we chose a novel was because we wanted to talk about the warrior ethos, the real warrior ethos. Leadership, camaraderie, and sacrifice. Now, the problem with using an academic treatment of this is that they are constrained by the rules of scholarship. They have to stick with the concrete and the factual. And what we're talking about was something that was completely intangible. So if we had used an academic treatise, what I could tell you was 300 Spartans died fighting a delaying action against overwhelming odds against the Persian invasion force at Thermopylae 2,500 years ago. So what? The thing was, the warrior ethos has more to do with the intangible, and in combat, the intangible is sometimes the most concrete. What we were trying to do in our presentation was not to bring those events forward, but to transport our colleagues backwards. We wanted them to feel what it might be like to be wearing bronze armor under a sweltering Mediterranean sun, after being exhausted with constant close quarters battle for 3 days, and knowing that if you take one step back, the entire situation could fall apart. You can't do that with an academic treatise. That can only be done through literature and through art. And this is why, 2,500 years on, despite the fact that the Greeks lost that battle, we know more about their defeat and hold it in higher regard than we do all their victories, such as Plataea. There's a name that you probably have never heard of, but you've all heard of the 300 Spartans, because it means something. And it's been told to us through stories. We've internalized it. Now, one last word, and then we'll get to the people who you really came to hear from. There is a passage, pardon me. Try this again, I'm done. Yeah. There's a passage in Gates of Fire where Leonidas the king is explaining to a Spartan noblewoman why it is he chose her son and her husband to march with him to the gates, to Thermopylae, the hot gates. These are not warriors of great reputation, so it's not clear why he chose these men. Leonidas explains, and I'm going to have to paraphrase because it's been 20 years since I've read this book, so bear with me. I chose them not for their valor, lady, but for that of their women. Greece stands now at its most vulnerable hour. If it is to save itself, it will not be here at the gates, Thermopylae, but in battles yet to come. When the battle is over and the 300 have gone down to death, all Greece will look to Sparta to see how we bear it. But who will the Spartans look to? To you and the wives and the mothers of the fallen. If they behold that your hearts are riven and broken with grief, they will break too. Forgive me, 20 years in this. But if you stand dry-eyed, Sparta will stand with you, and all Greece will stand behind them. There is no 1,000-page dissertation that can convey so easily and so quickly the relationship between the military and the society that sends it forth, better than in those very few lines. That is art, that is literature, that's why we're here. Now, Eve, if you would.
I'm just introducing our first reader, Malia Dumont. So please welcome Malia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mitch, for that very powerful beginning. So I'm going to read not from fiction. This is a short bit of memoir. It's from this book that was published in 2009. It's called Heroes of Film, Comics, and American Literature. And I was asked to write the afterword for this book. And the editor of this book asked me, what do you feel like when people call you a hero? What's your reaction to that? And so the afterword is about, again, touching on these themes of civil-military relations and how I, as a service member, interact with that kind of dynamic. So I wrote this in 2008 when I was serving at NATO in Belgium, and I had just finished a year of service in Afghanistan. So it's looking back on that. One day late in the summer of 2006, following a meeting at Camp Warehouse on the eastern edge of Kabul, 3 of my colleagues and I piled into a Mitsubishi Pajero for the drive back across town to our home base, Camp Eggers. A Navy lieutenant junior grade and an intelligence specialist, both of whom had been in Kabul for at least 6 months, were 2 of my companions. The other was a newly arrived Army sergeant, still reeling from jet lag and culture shock. I had been in country for about 3 months. I climbed into the driver's seat, and we all strapped on our helmets and body armor and loaded our weapons. Then we all grinned at each other ruefully as we proceeded out the front gate of the camp, onto Jalalabad Road, the most notorious road in the city. More bombings take place on Jalalabad Road than almost anywhere else in Afghanistan. Camp Eggers lay at the other end of it, a half-hour drive away. We had traveled to Camp Warehouse as part of a British military convoy, but we were on our own on the way back. It was my first time driving in Afghanistan, and also my first time in several years driving a stick shift. There was nothing for it but to just go for it. Out into the dust we went, onto the still under construction road, careening over and around potholes the size of craters, swerving out of the way of oncoming traffic, speeding around overloaded buses, avoiding donkey carts and loitering pedestrians, and all the while keeping a sharp lookout for suspicious activity such as solo drivers, aka possible car bombers, making a beeline for us, or a person in the crowds along the road making a signal to a possible bomber. With a few near accidents, including one close call with a bicyclist who decided to slowly cross the road just as I was speeding past a lumbering minivan, we made it across town and around the crazy chaos of Massoud Circle to the safety of the heavily guarded American Embassy area. Finally, elated and exhausted, even though relatively few minutes had passed, I parked the car at a safe house called the Alamo, and we all climbed out with relief. The newly arrived Army sergeant seemed dazed. "LT," he said, eyes blinking as if he were still trying to assimilate everything he had just witnessed, and also appreciate the fact that we amazingly were all still unscathed. "You're my hero." I laughed with appreciation and we all went back to work. I'm a hero. At least that's what they call me. They being usually people I barely know or have never met before. While none of my friends would ever embarrass me or themselves by using the word hero, several of them have made a point of saying how much they respect me for the choices I've made. It is so startling. The possibility of receiving this kind of recognition was the furthest thing from my mind when I joined the Army in 1999. I'm still unprepared to respond when people say such things to me, even though I recently returned from a year in Afghanistan and thus have directly participated in the war effort. I joined the military out of a sense of personal duty, not because I was looking for any unique opportunities to excite the pride of my compatriots. So it seems somewhat contradictory to my own ideals if I accept these compliments at face value, as if they were a motivating factor for joining the service or continuing in it. Nonetheless, I am grateful to be recognized. In this age, when less than 1% of Americans is in the military, and many Americans do not personally know any service members, it is a truism that many people thanking us for our service do not have even a general sense of what it is like to be in the military. Therefore, their thanks to us have to be based on something they do understand, like the sacrifices we make, rather than a knowledge of what we actually do. I happen to be an intelligence officer. While the contents of what I discuss with my colleagues on a daily basis are classified, the general outlines of my job are not. Yet it seems that the field of intelligence in particular remains shrouded in mystery for many Americans. Ironically, given how many publications seem to assume that intelligence is synonymous with cover-up or conspiracy, the closest civilian equivalent to my job is actually a journalist. I gather as much information as possible about a given topic of interest, such as insurgent plans for the next 3 months, or the state of the political opposition, or the amount of tribal support for the central government. And I provide my analysis. If I do my job well, hopefully my analysis helps guide decision makers as they determine our future courses of action. But I know that very few people understand what I do on a daily basis, or how I spend my days at work. So when they thank me for my service, they are more likely referring to an abstract ideal of service, rather than the details of my job. It doesn't bother me that such is the case, except insofar that I believe that the American public is increasingly isolated from and ignorant about its military. Paradoxically, the public overwhelmingly supports us and even lionizes us, even though, by and large, Americans don't know who we are or what we do. Over the past couple of years, I have followed public opinion polls with interest and have noticed that there seems to be an inverse relationship between the public's opinion of the government bureaucracy and its opinion of the military. The more Americans think the government is inefficient and unresponsive, the higher regard they appear to have for the military as an institution. It seems logical that if the public views bureaucrats and politicians with distaste, then the form of public service most worth lauding becomes the military. After all, to take a cynical view, we in the military are much less able to manipulate the system to our own credit own ends, and we stand to profit much less from our service. The few veterans I know make a special point of thanking me for my service. This is qualitatively different from the thanks I receive from non-military persons. Veterans are, in a way, welcoming me into the fold. They are thanking me for efforts in which, in a larger sense, they have also participated. The sacrifices I am making, they have also made. The work I am doing is a continuation of what they did. In fact, their sacrifices and work made mine possible. It is a sort of mutual acknowledgement of brotherhood, and by receiving their thanks, I'm likewise recognizing the share we have had in each other's work. I'm too young to remember Vietnam, but I'm sure that the treatment that veterans received following that war impels them to make positive expressions to today's veterans like me. Given the deep and apparently widening gulf in our country of those who support the military policies implemented under the Bush administration and those who do not, I find it somewhat surprising that this split has not translated, as it did during the Vietnam War, into differing levels of support for the military itself. It seems appropriate that as I write this, I'm listening to Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. The military is made up largely of common men, and a number of common women too. For being a woman in the military has never been the issue that outsiders expect. At least not for me. I like to say that I'm an officer with the irrelevant characteristic of being female. I spend about 1 hour per year being explicitly distinguished from my male colleagues during our semi-annual physical fitness tests. Other than that, we all work side by side. The only time I have felt discriminated against was during an incident in Afghanistan, when the Afghan National Army was not prepared to work closely with a woman. Sometimes a soldier will absent-mindedly call me sir instead of ma'am, and I actually enjoy those occasions. Sometimes the soldier in question is actually female. When the inevitable apology comes, I say, "It's okay, I'm gender neutral in this uniform." I love wearing the uniform. It is the great homogenizer. Whoever puts it on instantly becomes a member of the team. And personal characteristics such as gender fade into irrelevancy. When little boys see me in uniform after work, they say, "Look, a soldier." Not, "Look, a woman in uniform." It would not only be irrelevant, but also somewhat isolating to be recognized or celebrated specifically for being a woman. My husband, who is also in the military, and I plan to have children someday. If I decide to stay in the military, my children will have to live with the consequences of that decision, even though it would probably mean that I will be deployed far away from them for long periods of time. I think most mothers would have a hard time making such a choice. And many mothers would probably look askance at a woman who would. Fortunately, my husband is fully supportive of my service. We have a sort of mutual admiration society. My thoughts about being a mother are that I don't want to quit doing something so important. I don't want to send a signal that it is not possible to be both a mother and a service member. I want my children to see me in the uniform, know that I serve, and be proud of my service. I don't need to be a hero to my children, I just hope I can inspire them. For a variety of valid and understandable reasons, most Americans are unprepared to make the kind of sacrifices that are a daily reality in the military. Maybe people find nobility in those who undertake actions that they cannot conceive of doing themselves. Maybe a bit of nostalgia for the greatest generation of World War II colors the public's current view. But I also think that the public's growing ignorance and lack of direct experience of the military allows Americans to adopt a romantic view of what it means to serve. In retrospect, it is people like the army sergeant in my opening vignette who are heroes to me. Newly married, he had never been away from his wife before. He had never been out of the country. He had a young baby back home. He had no special training or education or life experience to prepare him to be sent to a foreign land on the other side of the world and try to figure out who the bad guy was and what he wanted. He was just a normal young man from a small town. He struggled mightily his first month in Kabul. The culture shock and the distance from home were almost too much for him to handle. But he persevered with a faith and a tenacity and a sense of discipline that I truly admired. Maybe a lot of Americans have those qualities and spiritual reserves deep down inside. Most will never have them tested to such an extent. Every day I witnessed ordinary people struggling to overcome all kinds of personal challenges. It was my honor and privilege to serve with all of them. It's called Heroes of Film, Comics, and American Culture from 2009. Our next reader is going to be the poet Doug Anderson.
Thanks, Nadia. 161 women were killed in Iraq. I don't know what the numbers are in Afghanistan, but it's happening. It's happening. I was a corpsman with the Marine Rifle Company. And I'm going to take you through a few days of the war. Night ambush. We are still, lips swollen with mosquito bites. A tree line opens out onto paddies quartered by dikes, a moon in each. And in the center, the hedged island of a village floats in its own time, ribboned with smoke. Someone is cooking fish. Whispers move across water. Children and old people. Anyone between is a target. It is so quiet you can hear a safety clicked off all the way on the other side. Things live in my hair. I do not bathe. I have thrown away my underwear. I have forgotten the why of everything. I sense an indifference larger than anything I know. All that will remain of us is rusting metal disappearing in vines. Above the fog that clots the hill ahead, a red tracer arcs and dims. A black snake slides off the paddy dike into the water and makes the moon shiver. Infantry assault. The way he made that corpse dance by emptying one magazine after another into it, and the way the corpse's face began to peel off like a mask because the skull had been shattered, brains spilled out, but he couldn't stop killing that corpse, wanted to make damn sure. I thought maybe he was killing all the ones he'd missed, and the way they dragged that guy out of the stream, cut him to pieces, the stream running red with all the bodies in it, and the way the captain didn't try to stop them, his silence saying, "No prisoners." And the way when all the Kong were dead, lined up in rows, 39 in all. Our boys went to work on all the pigs and chickens in the village until there was no place that was not red. And finally, how the thatch was lit, the village burned, and how afterwards we were quiet, riding back on the tracks, watching the ancestral serpent rise over the village in black coils, and how our bones knew what we'd done. Bamboo Bridge. We cross the bridge quietly. The bathing girl does not see us till we've stopped and gaped like fools. There are no catcalls, whoops, none of the things that soldiers do. The most stupid of us is silent, rapt. She might be 14 or 20, sunk thigh deep in green water, her woman's pelt a glistening corkscrew. A wonder she is, I forgot. For a moment we all hold the same thought, that there is life in life and war is shit. For a song we'd all go to the mountains, eat pineapples, drink goat's milk, find a girl like this. Who cares her teeth are stained with betel nut, her hands as hard as feet? If I can live another month, it's over, and so we think a single thought, a bell's resonance. And then she turns and sees us there, sinks in the water, eyes full of hate, the trance broken. We move into the village on the other side. Ambush. In the village, we unsling our rifles, drop our packs, light cigarettes, eat, piss, sleep, fly covered in the heat. Around comes by my ear an angry wasp, and crabwise I scuttle for a hole that isn't there. There is shouting everywhere, someone is hit. I see the lieutenant point his pistol with both hands. A water buffalo is bearing down on him, stampeded by the shooting. Beside a cistern, a monk, saffron-robed, squats and laughs. There is a woman running past, tripping on her auzi, but no, it's not. Before I can shout a warning, the garment comes unsashed. Instead of woman flesh, an automatic rifle flashes in an arc, and firing from the hip, the man runs for his life. Someone trying to duck smashes my nose with his elbow. It is now quiet. 7 bodies lie in the village road. 3 are ours. More are wounded. My cigarette not gone halfway. I begin to treat them. Judgment, near Hoi An, 1967. Pinned down 2 hours in a Buddhist graveyard by 2 barefoot snipers who will not die, no matter how many mortars we walk their way. They keep moving, the one firing, the other doubling back where the mortars have already been, nor are they silenced by the gunship now squandering rockets at ink blots flickering between trees. These wraiths sing with their crack and whine, we will die to hold you here, while the others slip away toward the mountains. What will you die for? Me hunkering behind a pitted tombstone, staring at a skull from a grave churned up by tanks. Xin Loi is I'm sorry in Vietnamese. Xin Loi. The man and woman, Vietnamese, come up the hill, carry something slung between them on a bamboo mat, unroll it at my feet. The child, iron gray, long dead, flies have made him home. His wounds are from artillery shrapnel. The man and the woman look as if they are cast from the same iron as their dead son, so rooted are they in the mud. There is nothing to say. Nothing in my medical bag, nothing in my mind. A monsoon cloud hangs above, its belly torn open on a mountain. I used to teach the Iliad, and all the people in the Iliad are princes or the sons of princes, tribal structure. So I thought I'd put some grunts in the Iliad. The bar in Argos. They'll tell you it was a wooden horse, I'll tell you it was not. We gutted 20 oxen and slid inside their empty bellies, but for our short swords naked, then were sewn up, delivered to the city gates as an offering of peace, acquiescent to Troy's enduring power. And that night, while the cooks made the fires to roast the beasts with us as stuffing, we cut the rawhide sutures and were borne out of the stink and slime, killing first the cooks, head first in their vats, their legs kicking, then moving through the streets, garroting sentries, dousing their torches in puddles, killing blindly, twice killing our own, catching Trojans in their beds, and Odysseus ecstatic, almost forgetting to open the city gates, the high point of his night, when with a pike he pinned a woman to her bed right through her lover's back. I tell you, I was sick. Still am. It rots your soul. It's just that anything you think is twisted, Odysseus can give another twist you wouldn't think was there to give. I'll tell you, the man's a son of a bitch. Wooden horse, fuck me. We were shat out of oxen to win that war. Odysseus in Old Greek means a man of twists and turns. How we doing out there? I'm going to read a couple more.
Please.
Itinerary. In Arizona, coming across the border with dope in my tires and for months tasting in the rubber and what I smoked, with a college degree and a trunk full of the war, working in one place long enough to get the money to stay high for a month and then moving on, drinking a quart of whiskey, then getting up, going to work the next day, a little speed to burn off the hangover, in the afternoon a few reds to take the edge off the speed, and then to the bar. At the bar, the Madonna in the red mirror, my arm around her waist, and the shared look that said, the world is coming apart. Let us hold one another against the great noise of it all. Waking with her next morning and seeing her older, her 3-year-old wandering in and staring with a little worm of confusion in his forehead, the banner on her bedroom wall that read acceptance in large block letters. At night, going out to unpack the war from my trunk, a sea bag full of jungle utilities that stank of rice paddy, silt, and blood, to remind myself it happened. Lost them somewhere between Tucson and Chicago. Days up on a scaffold, working gable end trim with Mexicans who came through a hole in the fence the night before, rednecks who paid me better than them, laughing at jokes that weren't funny to keep the job. At a New Braunfels Oktoberfest, getting in a fight with a black army private who wore a button that read, "Kiss me, I'm German." Don't remember what the fight was about. Back in Tucson, up against the patrol car being cuffed for something I don't remember doing. Leaving the state. Back with Jill in San Antonio. Finding her in the same bar, driving her home in her car because she was too drunk. The flashers on behind me, then the flashlight in my face. In those gentle days, they drove you home. Stealing Jill's car out of the impound lot next morning to avoid the fee. Later sitting buck naked across from one another at the breakfast table, wondering who we were. This woman who wanted to live with a man who had dreams so bad he would stay awake for days until the dreams started to bleed through into real time, and he had to go back the other way into sleep to escape. Who woke with the shakes before dawn and went to the kitchen for beer. Later, walking down to the barrio slowly, without talking, our hips touching. The Mexican restaurant, a pink adobe strung with chili pepper Christmas lights the year round. Inside, the bullfight calendar with a matador's corpse laid out on a slab, naked and blue, with a red cloth across his loins, and the inevitable grieving virgin kneeling at his side. The wound in the same place the centurion euthanized Christ with his spear. Our laughing, then not laughing, because laughter and grief are born joined at the hip. An old Mexican woman fanning herself at the cash register, her wattles trembling. Recordar, to remember, to pass again through the heart. Corazon, Coraggio, Cor. Colonel and Professor Caroline Pokey.
I don't know how to follow that one. So I'm going to give you two different readings. So many of you might have heard of Virginia Hall. She was a World War II in France, a civilian that worked there, and then ended up becoming one of the beginnings of the CIA here in the States. And then I'm going to give you another one of Ashley's War from Afghanistan. So women's perspectives from two very different points in time. So France was falling, burned out cars, one strapped high with treasured possessions, were nosed crazily into ditches. Their beloved cargoes of dolls, clocks, mirrors lay smashed around them, and along mile of unfriendly roads. Their owners, young and old, were sprawled across the hot dust, were groaning or already silent, yet the hordes just kept streaming past them, a never-ending line of hunger and exhaustion too fearful to stop for days on end. 10 million women, children, and old men were on the move, all fleeing Hitler's tanks pouring across the border from the east and the north. Entire cities had uprooted themselves in a futile bid to escape the Nazi blitzkrieg that threatened to engulf them. The fevered talk was of German soldiers stripped to the waist in jubilation at the ease of their conquest. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of the dead. The babies had no milk, the aged felled where they stood, the horses drawing overladen old farm carts sagged and snarled in their sweat-drenched agony. The French heat wave of May of 1940 was witness to this, and the large refugee exodus of all time. The largest refugee exodus of all time. Day after day, a solitary moving vehicle weaved its way through the crowd with a striking young woman at the wheel. Private Virginia Hall often ran low on fuel and medicine, but still pressed on in her French army ambulance toward the advancing enemy. She persevered even when the German Stukas came screaming down and dropped 110-pound bombs onto the convoys all around her, torching the cars and cratering the whole roads. Even when the fighter planes swept over the treetops to machine gun the ditches where women and children were trying to take cover from the carnage. Even then, though French soldiers were deserting their units, abandoning their weapons and running around, some in their tanks. Even when her left hip was shot with pain from continually pressing down on the clutch with her prosthetic foot. Now at the age of 34, her mission marked a turning point after years of cruel rejection. For her own sake, as much as for the casualties she was picking up from the battlefield and ferrying to the hospitals, she could not fail again. There were many reasons why she was willingly jeopardizing her life far from home in aid of a foreign country when millions of others were giving up. Perhaps foremost among them was that it had been so long since she had felt so thrillingly alive. Disgusted at the cowardice of the deserters, she could not understand why they would not continue the fight. But then she had so little to lose. The French still remembered sacrificing a third of their young menfolk to the Great War, and a nation of widows and orphans were in no mood for more bloodshed. Virginia, though, intended to go on to the end, wherever that battle took her. She was prepared to take whatever risks face down any dangers. Total war against the Third Reich might perversely offer one last hope of personal peace. Yet even this was at nothing compared to what was to come in the life that drew out in her Homeric tale of adventure, action, and seemingly unfathomable courage. Virginia Hall's service in France the summer of 1940 was merely an apprenticeship for her near-suicide mission against the tyranny of the Nazis and their puppets in France. She helped to pioneer a daredevil role of espionage, sabotage, and subversion behind enemy lines in an era when women barely featured in the prism of heroism, when their part in combat was confined to the supportive and palliative, when they were just expected to look nice and act obedient and let the men do the heavy lifting. When disabled women or men were confined to staying at home and leading often narrow, unsatisfying lives. The fact that a young woman who had lost her leg in tragic circumstances broke through the tightest constrictions and overcame prejudice and even hostility to help the Allies win the Second World War is astonishing. That a female guerrilla leader of her stature remains so little known to this day is incredible. Yet that is perhaps how Virginia would have wanted it. She operated in the shadows, and that was where she was happiest. Even to her closest allies in France, she seemed to have no home or a family or a regiment, merely a burning desire to defeat the Nazis. They knew neither her real name, or her nationality, nor how she had arrived in their midst. Constantly changing in looks and demeanor, surfacing without noticing across whole swaths of France, only to disappear again as suddenly. She remained an enigma throughout the war, and in some ways after it too. Even now, tracing her story has involved 3 solid years of detective work, taking the author to the National Archives of London, the Resistance Files in Lyon, the parachute drop zones in Haute de Loire, to the judicial dossiers in Paris, and even the white marble corridors of the CIA headquarters in Langley. Her research led her through 9 levels of security clearance into the heart of today's world of American espionage. The author discussed the pressures of operating in enemy territory with the former members of the British Special Forces, ex-intelligence officers on both sides of the Atlantic, and tracked down files that were missing, discovering others that were mysteriously lost or unaccounted for. In her secret universe, when virtually the whole of Europe, from the North Sea to the Russian frontier, was under the Nazi heel, trust was an unaffordable luxury. Mystique was as vital as concealable Colt pistol. And yet, in an era when the world again seems to be tilting toward division and extremism, her example of camaraderie across borders in pursuit of a higher ideal stands out now more than ever. Nor have governments made it easy to fill in the gaps. Scores of relevant documents are still classified for another generation, and the author had to manage to get a number of them released for this book to be the invaluable aid of two former intelligence officers. Still more went up in flames when the French archives had a devastating fire in the 1970s, leaving an unfillable hole in official accounts. Whole batches of papers at the National Archives and Records Administration, the NARA in Washington, D.C. have apparently been mislaid or misfiled, and a handy list of them apparently overlooked moving between buildings. Only 15% of the original papers from Special Operations Executive, the British Secret Service that Virginia worked for from 1941 to 1944, survive. Yet for all these challenges and twists and turns down dark alleys, Virginia's story has never disappointed. In fact, it has repeatedly turned out to be so more extraordinary, its characters more vivid, its significance greater than the author could have imagined. She helped to change espionage and views of women in warfare forever, and in the course of fighting in France. Virginia's enemies were more deadly, her conduct more daring than many a Hollywood blockbuster fantasy. And yet the swashbuckling tale is true. Virginia, a real-life hero, who kept going even when all seemed lost. The pitiless universe of deception and intrigue that she inhabited might have inspired Ian Fleming to create James Bond, yet she came closer to becoming the ultimate spy. Eventually, every bit as ruthless and wily as the fictional Commander Bond, she also understood the need to blend in and keep her distance from friends and foe alike. Where Bond was known by name to every international baddie, she slipped through all her enemies unseen. Where Bond drove a flashy Aston Martin, she traveled by train or tram, or despite her disability, by foot. Where Fleming's character seemed to rise seamlessly to the top, Virginia had a battle for every inch of recognition and authority. Her struggle made her the figure she became, one who survived, even thrived in clandestine life that broke many apparently far more suited to the job. No wonder today's chief of the British intelligence agency, MI6, has revealed that her searches for recruits who do not shout loud or show off, but who have had to fight to get in on life. Virginia was a human being with flaws, fears, insecurities, just like the rest of us, perhaps even more, but they helped her understand her enemies. Only once did her instincts let her down with catastrophic consequence. For the most part, though, she conquered demons and won the trust, admiration, and ultimately the gratitude of thousands in the process. To me, Virginia was clearly never to forget her. Until the moment she retired in the 1960s from her post-war career as a CIA, she was a woman ahead of her time who has much to say to us now. Controversies still rage about women fighting alongside men in the front lines, but nearly 8 decades, Virginia was already commanding men deep in enemy territory. She experienced 6 years of the European War in a way that very few other Americans did. She gambled again and again with her own life, not out of a fervent nationalism for her own country, but out of a love and respect for the freedoms of another. She blew up bridges and tunnels, tricked and traded, and like 007 had a license to kill. What she pursued was a very modern form of warfare based on propaganda, deceit, and the formation of an enemy within. Techniques now increasingly familiar to all of us. But her goals were noble. She wanted to protect rather than destroy, to restore liberty rather than remove it. She neither pursued fame or glory, nor was she really granted it. This book is not a military account of the battle for France, nor an analysis of the shifting shapes of espionage or the evolving role of special forces, although of course they weave a rich and dramatic background of Virginia's tale. The book is rather an attempt to reveal how one woman really did help turn the tide of history, how adversity and rejection and suffering can sometimes turn in the end into resolve, ultimately triumph, even against the backdrop of a horrifying conflict that casts its long shadows over the way we live today. How women can step out of the construct of conventional femininity to defy all stereotypes, if only they are given the chance. And how, despite urgencies of war can perversely open up opportunities that normal life tragically keeps closed. Of course, Virginia, who served in the British and American Secret Service, did not work alone. The supporting cast of doctors, prostitutes, farmers' wives, teachers, booksellers, and policemen have equally been forgotten and often paid dearly for their valor. Just as what they did was for the cause was inspired in part by lofty romance and ideals, so also were they aware that failure and capture meant a lonely and grisly death. Some of the Third Reich's most venerable and terrifying figures were obsessed with Virginia and her networks and strove tirelessly to eliminate her and the whole movement she helped to create. But when the hour of France's liberation came in 1944, the secret armies she equipped, trained, and sometimes directly defied expectations and helped bring about complete and final victory for the Allies, even though that was not enough for her. Virginia did not receive the recognition she deserved from her CIA career, but toward the end of her life, there were signs of her legacy was becoming understood. Eloise Randolph Page, who became the first woman chief of staff of the CIA in the 70s, talked of how women of the OSS, of whom Virginia was a leading example, prepared the groundwork for sisters who came after them. Today, Virginia is often recognized by the CIA as an unqualified heroine of the war, whose career at the agency was held back by frustrations with superiors who did not use her talents well. In June of 1988, Virginia's name was posthumously added to the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame by Major General Parker. She was one of the first people to be honored this way. After persistent lobbying by her supporters in France and elsewhere, even after her death, France and Britain celebrated Virginia's life in a ceremony at the French ambassador's residence in Washington in December 2006. The ambassador read a letter of homage from President Jacques Chirac, honoring her as an American friend of France. It was the first time the country publicly acknowledged her as a true hero of French resistance. No one seemed aware of or mentioned her, I do not speak French, Croix de Guerre, the certificate for Virginia's MBE, which has remained on a desk in London in 60 years, was handed finally to her niece, Lorna Catling, by the British ambassador. A painting of the artist Jeff Bass was unveiled at the same event and showed Virginia transmitting a radio message next to her young resistance fighter Edmund Lebrat at Leah Lebrat's farm in Hart-Lior in summer of 1944. The original hangings in the CIA headquarters in Langley, just around the corner from a life-size statue of her one-time OSS boss and greatest admirer, Wild Bill Donovan. Copies have been put up all around the world, including the Special Forces Club in London. In the current official catalog for the CIA Museum, there are only 5 OSS operatives deemed deserving of their own section. 4 were men who became directors of the CIA. The 5th is Virginia, the only woman and the only one to struggle in her post-war career. In December 2016, the CIA named a building after her. New recruits were put through their paces and taught why she was an all-time great in the Virginia Hall Expeditionary Center. There are 6 facets to today's CIA ethos: service, excellence, integrity, courage, teamwork, and stewardship. Virginia has been chosen to represent service, but she is not ranked as a trailblazer, a list of officers deemed to have shaped the agency's history. Yet SOE and OSS, and notably Virginia's pioneering work setting up circuits in France, inspires much of what goes on in even today's special forces. The CIA acknowledged that the Jawbreaker team it sent into Afghanistan before and after 9/11 in 2001 was direct descendant of her secret operations from the French resistance in World War II. CIA officers were infiltrated in northern Afghanistan to collect intelligence and later to recruit, arm, and equip local groups to assist in the forthcoming American offensive against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. To read more, you can see that later. So now I'm going to skip into Afghanistan, into a book called Ashley's War, which is about the female engagement teams in Afghanistan. So in April 2010, Admiral William McRaven, the highly regarded head of the Joint Special Operations Command, submitted a formal request to Olson at SOCOM, Special Operations Command, that women soldiers be made available to join Rangers on missions. It was based on a radical premise from a forward-thinking leader that women enablers would make Rangers missions more successful. This idea was the best female soldiers in the Army would join the 75th Ranger Regiment Elite Strike Forces as they went out on their nightly direct action raids to get terrorists and insurgents. JSOC, McRaven's command, came to life in the early 80s following the humiliation of a failed attempt to free American hostages in Iran. In the aftermath of this disastrous aborted mission that ended with 8 American service members dead, the Pentagon created a commission to figure out how so much had gone wrong. One of the panel's recommendations was the creation of a joint command that would create a cohesive team for special operators from the toughest units in the service: SEALs, the Navy SEALs, Air Force Special Operations pilots, Army's Delta Force and Green Berets, and eventually the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment. In 2003, General Stanley McChrystal took command of JSOC and over 5 years oversaw its evolution into a speed-sensitive, data-driven, high-value targeting machine. Insurgents would be targeted and targeted again when they were captured, until they were captured. Each raid yielded new information that produced the next set of targets. The results were astounding. Raids on terrorist homes, weapons depots, and safe houses that had taken days to plan in 2003 required, by 2010, mere minutes. In August 2004, JSOC had overseen 18 night raids in Iraq over the course of a single month. In August 2006, it was 300. McChrystal used a civilian analogy to describe JSOC evolution from specialized force into an organization dedicated and shaped by the power of its network. We started the war as the greatest bookseller in the world and ended as Amazon.com. America's premier raid force had morphed into a ferocious, organized, streamlined organization powered by data from across the U.S. government and had fought to become an adaptable as it was formidable enemy, the Al-Qaeda network. Responsible for the tactics and planning missions moved downward to ground-level commanders as the pace of raids surged. No longer would Delta, Green Berets, and SEALs, the most special guys of special ops, handle all the workload. As McChrystal put it in 2014, when we started going at a faster and faster pace, it was just unsustainable to have guys that weren't hitting targets so suddenly. They said, "Ranger, you take this target. Special Forces, you take this target," which caused everybody to be hitting targets on their own. Rangers, who had begun in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq as little brothers of special ops, the typical younger guys who supported more seasoned elite units on big operations, now became central to the success. The Rangers matured in their assignments, their competence, sophistication, and confidence grew in turn. McCraven succeeded McChrystal at JSOC in 2008, and he built on the ever-increasing agility and non-stop operational tempo of his predecessor and mentor had instituted. But like Admiral Olson, Admiral McCraven, the author of Special Ops, a book filled with case studies in special operations warfare, felt certain they weren't getting the whole job done if half the population remained out of reach. For his part, McChrystal, now in charge of the whole American war in Afghanistan, effort in Afghanistan, still felt stung by review years earlier of an operation that had cost hearts, minds, and allies. His men had raided a compound and followed what they thought were strict, careful, and culturally sensitive procedures. They hadn't searched the women and instead had ushered them into a different part of the compound before moving through the house, searching everything, including the women's quarters. "We got the feedback later that you had dishonored the women," McChrystal remembers. How? He and his men had asked the question. They had never even come close to them. The answer that came back stunned McChrystal. "It doesn't matter," he was told. "You went through their things, you touched their clothing." That was a level of ignorance we still had, and this was pretty late in the war, McChrystal observes, noting that while U.S. forces increasingly understood the broad outlines of the Afghan culture, the nuances often remained out of reach. By 2010, the fight in Afghanistan was going badly enough that all anyone wanted was a solution that would work. For the past decade, women had been serving in combat, McChrystal notes, regardless of official policy. As intel analysts, combat pilots in Delta Force, women had won Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars with valor, and had been killed and grievously wounded alongside their male colleagues. McCraven was a particular problem solver. What had been unthinkable just 5 years earlier because of preconceptions about American servicewomen in combat, as well as ignorance about the role of women in Afghan culture, now became unavoidable. McCraven had a decision. Female soldiers would now officially accompany the Rangers on target. Ideology be damned. This was it. That it was the knuckle-dragging Rangers who first asked for the female enablers had irony for many. McChrystal notes that the old joke was that the N in Ranger stood for knowledge. Those were not touchy-feely men. They were blunt instruments of special operations. Guys whose idea of fun was guzzling a Rip-It energy drink, working out for 2 hours, and then getting into a gunfight against bad guys. Nor did they bother with building foreign forces or forging relationships with locals, which was a specialty of the storied Green Berets. The Rangers had pure and easy quantifiable mandate. You either get the insurgent you want, or you didn't. And by now, McCraven was ready to employ any smart strategy that would make his men and their mission more effective. So when McCraven's official request for forces landed on his desk, Olson viewed it as an immediate call to action. This was no longer about his idea of the yin and yang of warfare. Olson told the men who worked for him this was a hard requirement from a JSOC commander in the field. And everyone knew that what JSOC requested, JSOC received. Olson immediately began putting wheels in motion, beginning with the request to the Army Special Operations Command to start training the new teams of female soldiers at Fort Bragg headquarters. Olson divided the teams with two groups. The direct action side would go into the counterterrorism focused units alongside the Rangers. The second group would accompany the more indirect action teams out in the hinterlands where Green Berets forged relationships with local people and their leaders. These women would be part of VSOs, or Village Stability Operations. In the meantime, Olson consulted his lawyers about the ban on women in ground combat and learned that as long as he attached them rather than assigned them, women could be attached to the special operations units, and he could put them almost anywhere, including on missions with Rangers. Finally, there was an issue of the team's name. Everyone agreed that the word female should be avoided, since that would make acceptance all harder among these all-male units. Since the concept of teamwork was so fundamental to special operations and its distinctive sense of community, they all agreed that it would be a team. Otherwise, another carefully selected word would help blunt the argument for those who thought the program was just a way for door knockers, a backdoor way for women to become frontline operators. Support. Finally, they needed a term that would express the idea that the American female soldier would make inroads into the Afghan social fabric to reach places and people that men couldn't. Cultural. The Cultural Support Team, or CSTs, were born. And so it was from Olson's kernel of an idea about female service members could do that men could not, from McChrystal's desire to win and his experience on the ground, and from McCraven's request for women to support his men, there grew a series of conversations that matured into a plan that took unexpected turns and eventually produced a program that led Second Lieutenant Ashley White and her female comrades into the battlefield in Kandahar, Afghanistan, late one night in August 2011. Cassie, one of the CSTs selected through the process, which is the middle of the book, sat bumping up in her seat as a lumbering C-17 flew east to Germany's Ramstein Air Base. Each of the CSTs had received a letter just before graduation, and Cassie now thought about its contents as she rode to war with her nearly 20 comrades in arms. It was a personal letter printed on gray and white stationery and was from Captain Tara Matthews, who had been a program manager for the CST's classroom training this summer. For nearly 3 years, Matthews had served in special operations as a team leader in civil affairs. Matthews had come home to Fort Bragg after deploying to Afghanistan and had run the summer training program. Matthews had been efficient and effective, but the CSTs hadn't sensed that she possessed any deeply held views on their path-breaking program or had considered its place in women's long march toward combat. Then at the very end of the course, she surprised her students by sharing this letter. Just as they were on the verge of starting their own tours in Afghanistan, Matthews was older than most of the CSTs, but only by a few years. And as she read her words, they heard the voice of someone who had been through a great deal, now wanting to share what she knew with a group of women who she obviously felt a strong connection. Cassie had read and reread the letter she found inside the folder holding her graduation certificate, and although the note was addressed to the entire group, she felt that Matthews was speaking directly to her in a very personal way. The ultimate effects of this program on the coming generations are yet to be seen, she had written. Thank you for rising to the challenge of being female warriors in today's Army. I don't know if you recognize that your presence here has been foretold by the generations of women that preceded you in military service to the nation, and that you walk a path in advance of a more efficient and tested generation that will strive to follow you and carry us into the future. The mission has not yet run its course. Don't limit your actions in pursuit of success. Take a measured course in a wide berth within your lines of operation. Show us all of what you are capable of. And that's exactly what I intended to do, Cassie silently vowed. Know, too, that the eyes of the Army and increasingly the nation are on you. This is an opportunity for failure as much as it is for success. Do not block out voices of opposition. Study them and defeat their words and prejudices through brilliant action. Cassie had felt strongly from the beginning, perhaps more than most of the other women, that the CSTs were, whether they liked it or not, a group of trailblazers who had better not mess things up for those who would come after them. And she was awed by the women who had come before them, especially the one female soldier who had gone out with the Rangers on missions long before the CST program was in place. The subtext of Captain Matthews' letter was clear. If one of them screwed up, it wouldn't just be her mistake, it would be for all women. In her heart, Cassie saw herself as just another soldier who was taking part in an ancient struggle to live up to the potential as a warrior. She didn't see herself as a female soldier, just a soldier. But Cassie's own path had shown her that there was still a long way to go before military women would have the same opportunities as men, from serving in infantry and to attending Ranger School to trying out to full-fledged members of Special Operations Forces. And in January 13, the ban on women in ground combat units officially ended. The rules had at last caught up to the reality. 152 women in uniform have died serving this nation in Iraq and Afghanistan. This was in 2013. Female service members had faced the reality of combat, proven their willingness to fight, and yes, to die to defend their fellow Americans, said Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta at a news conference with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey. Every time I would visit the war zone, every time I've met troops, reviewed military operations, and talked to wounded warriors, I've been impressed with the fact that everyone, man and woman alike, everyone is committed to doing the job. They're fighting and they're dying together, and the time has come for our policies to recognize that reality. Said Panetta, if they are willing to put their lives on the line, then we ought to recognize that they deserve a chance to serve in any capacity they want. 6 months later, on June 13, the cultural support team came up in a Pentagon news conference focused on integrating women into jobs that previously had been off limits to them, including roles in special operations. Quite frankly, I was encouraged by just the physical performance of some of these young girls who aspired to go into the CSTs, said SOCOM Major General Bennett Sokolek, who called the program a huge success. He went on to say, they very well may provide a foundation for ultimate integration.
Yes.
What we will do is press on through. The second half will be about 30 minutes, and there is a bathroom in the kitchen on the other side if anyone wants to slip out. But I think we'll just do that, press on through, rather than have a break, but you can take a break yourselves. So I would like to welcome Paul Alexander.
Arthritis, I'm moving slowly. I'm here in the capacity of a journalist and a biographer who covered John McCain, starting with his first presidential run when he started the Straight Talk Express up in New Hampshire. And I'm going to read a little bit about him, but I want to talk about him too in more informal terms, because I spent so much time with him over a decade. Interviewing him for pieces I wrote about him for magazines for this book. Had a radio show at one point. He was a regular guest. I probably interviewed McCain 25 or 30 times. So I feel like I know the senator well. I know his thinking on certain issues that we're dealing with today. I am going to speak on the military-civilian divide from what I think he would think. But to understand John McCain, it's really simple. He was a sailor. That's it. No matter what he did, no matter where he was a sailor. And so you hear about the history of the McCain family, but people don't really know about the history of the McCain family. It's probably the greatest military family in American history when you look at the breadth of the family. The only American family in American history to have 2 four-star admirals. 4 John Sidney McCains have attended the Naval Academy. 4. And so when you really look at where he comes from, that's who he was. No matter what heights he reached in politics, he was a sailor. So I want to read 3 paragraphs about his father and his grandfather, who will, where are the glasses?
It's the trouble with looking for your glasses. You need your glasses to look for your glasses.
I found them. So, we'll start with the grandfather, who was a real character. This is the reading part that he was requiring us to do.
You can ignore me.
Yeah. On September 5th, 1945, during a peaceful and beautiful evening in the San Diego area, Vice Admiral John Sidney McCain settled into his home in Corrado, California. His wiry frame had become dangerously thin. He weighed just over 100 pounds, and his face was weather-beaten from the years at sea, McCain, nicknamed Slew by his fellow officers and Popeye by the sailors he commanded, was exhausted, dragged down by a cold. He may have also suffered an undetected heart attack within the previous few months. The summer, which had finally brought an end to World War II, had been especially hard on him. He had commanded the 2nd Carrier Task Force Pacific Fleet since August 1944. In the final year of the war, operating in conjunction with the 3rd Fleet under the commander William F. Halsey, McCain's Task Force 38, quote, spearheaded the drive in the Philippines, to quote from the his official naval biography, supported the capture of Okinawa and rode rampant through the Western Pacific and the Indochina coast to the Japanese home island. His force knew only one word: attack. Task Force 38's motto certainly fit its commander. Slew McCain was gruff, hard-edged, quick-tempered, frequently profane, sometimes suspicious, always hardworking, and prone to sullenness. He also liked to slam down bourbon, play the horses, shoot craps, and roll his own Burl Durham cigarettes with his grandson. He was unwaveringly patriotic, stubbornly ambitious, and brilliant. Most important, he was a leader. In the 6 months of the war in the Pacific, McCain's Task Force 38 was cited for damaging or destroying 6,000 Japanese planes, and either sinking or damaging an estimated 2 million tons of Japanese warships. The task force airplane once sank 49 Japanese ships in a single day. Between July 1910 and August 14, 1945, McCain's planes destroyed some 3,000 grounded Japanese planes. All in all, McCain's accomplishments were nothing short of phenomenal. Indeed, Slew McCain, with his great trademark ill-fitting sailor hat, hence the Popeye reference, had established a reputation that would become nearly mythic in naval lore. The legend centered around one fact: McCain was a fighter. He refused to back off, ever. Regarding the Japanese, he once professed killing them all, painfully. Even when the Allied forces had won the war, McCain was ready to keep going. At the signing of the peace accords on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945, he was there. A ceremony that Halsey insisted McCain had attend, even though he was sick and anxious to go home. McCain glared at the deck, unable to bring himself even to look at the just defeated enemy. He went home to his home in Southern California, and 2 days later at the welcome home party, he dropped out of a heart attack, no doubt caused from all of the pressure he had been under during that 6 months description of this incredible destruction of the enemy. That was John McCain's grandfather. John McCain's father. In the years after World War II, with the example of his father urging him on, John McCain continued to, this is John McCain the second, Jr. John McCain continued to excel in the Navy his father loved so much. In November 1945, to take a break from the many months he had spent at sea during the war, Jack, that was what they called him, assumed the position of Director of Records for the Bureau of Naval Personnel in the Department of the Navy in Washington. Quote, "They brought me back to put me in charge of the records activity," Jack McCain would recall. And there was something like 1 million enlisted men records, and I forgot how many officer records, but there was a backlog of filing the papers into these records in the neighborhood of several million sheets. And when you went into several million, if anything, you're getting into real problems of management. I had a team there of 500 sailors, 300 or 400 waves, obviously female sailors. I must admit, it's an interesting job because you read all sorts of things about people that you don't ordinarily get your hands on. So during this time, it was sort of a rest period for him because he would eventually end up becoming involved in the active fighting again, and ultimately be the head of CENTCOM during Vietnam. At the time, his son was shot down in Hanoi, and part of the whole drama is there was that the enemy realized they had the son of this major American military figure. Now here's Johnny. In the early 50s, Jack's son Johnny was poised to enter the family business by first attending SLU and Jack's alma mater, the Naval Academy. In 4 years, Jack McCain would earn the rank of admiral. That was his father. Before his career ended, his promotion to 4-star admiral made the McCains the only family in American history to have both a father and a son reach that rank. But this thing came much later. In 1954, as he prepared to enter the Naval Academy, Johnny McCain already felt enormous pressure to live up to the remarkable accomplishments of his father and his grandfather. And so he went in to the Navy expecting that he was going to become the third John Sidney McCain to become a 4-star admiral. I did talk to the senator about this. And of course what happened, unlike his father and his grandfather, he wanted to fly airplanes. And so he trained, and he ran several missions over Vietnam. And of course, as we know, on one of them, he was shot down, landed in Hanoi in the body of water. He was captured. He was sent to the Hanoi Hilton, where he would remain for 5 years. 2 of those 5 years, he was tortured almost daily, to the point where his body never ever physically recovered from the torture. I was on the trail with McCain many, many times. He had to have a body man with him because he could never reach his hands above this height. So if you're going out to do a speech, you have to comb your hair, right? So he had a body man who would comb his hair for him, and then he would go out and do the speech. But if you see pictures of him, he's always like that, because when you're tortured for 2 years and your body is not medically treated and it recovers the way it recovers, and you just have whatever function that you have. And so that ended his military career basically. When he came back after 5 years, they obviously, he retired from the military. He was given the rank of captain, and he was stationed in the Senate to be the Senate liaison for the Navy and the Senate. And that's when he first got the bug to go into politics. But up until that point, he assumed he would be right on that path with his father and his grandfather. And so even though he ended up obviously rising to the top ranks of the American political system, he was always a sailor in his mind. That's what he was. And he instilled this in his children. So his oldest son with Cindy, he had 2 marriages and children from both, some adopted in the first. But he and Cindy had 3 children together. And the oldest son was John Sidney McCain IV, who also went to the Naval Academy and who served. He's now retired, and I expect to see him a political career before long. And then he had his second son, whose name is James, nicknamed Jimmy, and he was the great disappointment in the family. McCain was so disappointed in him because Jimmy grew up. He did not go into the Navy. he went into the Marines. And he never got over that. His best friend was Orson Swindle, and they would fight all the time because he was a Marine. So they would go back and forth on which was the best, which was the best. And so obviously he had a distinguished career. He's now too retired from the Marines, but is I think in the National Guard. And Jack McCain is what they call the oldest son. He's in I think he's in a reserve. I can't remember which wing. And so this is the McCain family. This is it. 4 generations rising to the top ranks that we have to offer in this country. And so I think that I would know what he would have to say about what's going on in terms of the military-civilian divide, because I had countless conversations with him over a decade in many capacities at 3 of his homes. Well, it was Cindy's homes, just so you know, he'd have known them. In Washington. Yeah, the thing about McCain, he signed a prenup before he married Cindy, so he never owned any of her property. All that goes to the children. Mm-hmm. He owned the place in Alexandria where he lived, because Cindy's father wouldn't let him marry her if he didn't sign the prenup. So when they would attack him for being rich and everything, I'm going, he's not rich. Cindy's rich. He's married to a rich woman, but he's not. So I want to say this. I think there are 3 things I know that McCain would be against. He would be against having military parades in the streets of Washington, D.C. Yes. Military parades, I think the senator would say, would be reserved for when we win world wars. That's when we have parades. Yes. We don't have parades to show off the fact that we have the greatest army since the Roman army. We don't do that. That's self-indulgent. You don't send American military into the streets of American cities. I don't think he would he would never endorse that. You don't have American military attack American citizens. That's not what we do. And I think he would be horrified in this moment. I think he would be speaking out. He was never silent. Remember that?
Yeah.
That's what he would be doing now. He would be playing his part in trying to advance the continuation of the great tradition of the military without misusing it and abusing it and insulting the members of the military, in my opinion, in the process. So I wanted to end on this. This was one of his favorite poems. It's called Requiem by Robert Louis Stevenson. Under the wide and starry night, dig the grave and let me die. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. Thank you.
And now we have John McEnroe. Okay.
John McEnroe.
I think anybody who served in the military is opposed to having military parades as well, but for different reasons. You have to polish your boots. None of this is good. Unlike some, I've got to take my glasses off to read. I looked at a number of pieces of literature that came out of the Great War. Great War, of course, World War I, before we knew that they should have numbers. One of them was Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Another one was A.A. Milne's Tales of Winnie the Pooh, and the third one was C.S. Lewis. All served in the Great War. All approached their writings in different ways. And I chose to take a take on Tolkien because he talks about there are 5 types of veterans that come out. Each veteran is different, of course, but he talks about the 4 most common stereotypes of veterans, omitting, of course, the typical ones that we see here in Beacon, the angry veteran. But he did recognize that not all who come back from war come back the same way. Each of the 4 hobbits in the story take a different trajectory. Frodo is the one who can't be healed. He's the one that we see on the movie, or on the commercials in late night TV with the Wounded Warrior Foundation. Sam is the one who heals through love and purpose. Merry is the one who grows through leadership, and Pippin is he's the young guy, probably lied about his age to enlist. He comes home much more mature, but has struggled to fit in. So modern soldiers come home in much of the same way. The main character, Frodo, is oddly not the protagonist that he appears to be. Sam is really the hero of the story, and he's the one that ultimately represents the best of our veterans. The percentage that one encounters of the 9 members of the original alliance that goes out in the early part of the book pretty much represents the way we come home as well, or the way we serve, I'm sorry. Basically, one goes on to be a great national leader, one goes on to be an advisor to this leader, and then ends up running a nonprofit. 2 go on to form really unlikely friendships. They're guys, you hear stories particularly out of Vietnam where somebody goes in and he's an absolute racist, and he becomes friends with a black guy. 2 wear their veterans gear constantly. 1 is killed, 1 has PTSD and pulls the plug, and the other goes on to be a local success. So from the last and possibly the shortest chapter of the trilogy, The Great Havens, all things went well. The hope was always that things would still be better, and Sam was as busy and as full of delight as even a hobbit could wish. Nothing for him marred that whole year, except some vague anxiety about his master. Frodo dropped quietly out of all doings of the Shire, and Sam was pained to notice how little honor he had in his own country. Few people knew or wanted to know about his deeds and adventures. Their admiration and respect were given mostly to Mr. Meriadoc and Mr. Peregrine, and if Sam had known it, to himself. Also in the autumn, there appeared a shadow of old troubles. One evening, Sam came home to the study and found his master looking very strange. He was very pale, and his eyes seemed to see things far away. "What's the matter, Mr. Frodo?" said Sam. "I am wounded," he answered. "Wounded, and it will never really heal." But he got up, and the turn seemed to pass, and was quite himself the next day. It was not until afterwards that Sam recalled the date was October 6th. 2 years before on that day was the dark night under the dell under Weathertop. Excuse me. Not even with my glasses off can I read. Time went on, and 1421 came in. Frodo was ill again in March, but with some great effort he concealed it, for Sam had other things to worry about. The first of Sam and Rosie's children were born on the 25th of March, a date that Sam also noticed. Again, skipping ahead. "Well, Sam," Frodo said, I want you to see Rose and see if she can spare you so that you and I can go off together. You can't go far or for a long time now, of course," he said a little wistfully. "Well, not very well, Mr. Frodo." "Of course not, but never mind. You can see me on my way. Tell Rose you won't be away very long, not more than a fortnight, and you'll come back quite safe." "I wish I could go all the way to Rivendell, Mr. Frodo, and see Mr. Bilbo," said Sam. "And yet, the only place I really want to be is here. I'm torn in 2. "Poor Sam, it'll feel like that, I'm afraid," said Frodo. "But you will be healed. You were meant to be solid and whole, and you will be." Again, skipping ahead towards the very end of the chapter. Then Bilbo woke up and opened his eyes. "Hello, Frodo," he said. "Well, I've passed the old Took today. So that is settled, and now I think I'm quite ready to go on another journey. Are you coming?" "Yes, I'm coming," said Frodo. "The ring-bearers should travel together." "Where are you going, Master?" cried Sam. At last he began to understand what was happening. "To the Havens, Sam," said Frodo. "And I can't come?" "No, Sam, not yet anyway. Not further than the Havens. Though you 2 were a ring-bearer, if only for a little time, your time may come. Don't be too sad, Sam. You cannot always be torn in 2. You have to be one and whole for many years, and you have much to enjoy, to be and to do. But Sam said with the tears starting in his eyes, I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire. I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire too, for years and years after all you've done. So I thought too once. But I've been too deeply hurt, Sam. I've tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It often must be so, Sam. When things are in danger, someone has to give them up, to lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are my heir, and all that I had and might have, I leave to you. And you have Rose and Eleanor, and you will be mayor, of course, for as long as you want to be, and the most famous gardener in history. And you will read things out of the Red Book, and keep alive the memory of the age that is gone, so that people remember the great danger, and so love their beloved land all the more. And that will keep you as busy and as happy as anyone can be, as long as you want your part of the story to go on. And skipping ahead again, at last they rode over the downs and took the East Road, and then Merry and Pippin rode on to Buckland, and already they were singing again as they went. But Sam turned to Bywater, and so he came back up the hill. And as the day was ending once more, he went on, and there was a yellow light and a fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in and set him in the chair and placed little Eleanor on his lap. He drew a deep breath. Well, I'm back, he said, and here the book ends. So despite the take from the Wounded Warrior Project, which is an extraordinary organization, they do terrific work. It's not necessary to recognize the Samwise Ganges of the world, those who've come back and remake the world and rebuild it. And so I took a couple of notes on the experiences that they had. Frodo Baggins is the wounded warrior that isn't going to make it. He's physically and psychologically damaged. He can't re-engage in normal life. He reflects, he journals, he ultimately leaves Middle Earth, which I would interpret as committing suicide. He comes home, and home feels very different, and that's because he's very different. He can't get back to normal, as many of our colleagues can't get back to normal. He seeks escape, isolation, therapy, suicide, substances. He needs long-term care, and he's not going to just get over it. Sam comes back, he's the resilient veteran. He's the one that we all want to be. He builds a family, he becomes mayor, he revitalizes his county. He carries the memories of war because that's inescapable, but he honors the past while he's building a future. Meridoc is the empowered veteran. He comes back with new confidence. He leads the scouring of the Shire, which is putting down a rebellion that needed to be done. He gains stature, and he's more important than he was before he went off to war. Peregrine is the young guy. I think he dropped out of high school, enlisted in the army. Off he goes. He has no idea what's going to happen. He has struggled to come back and fit into normal life, and yet he still manages to do it. He grows up very fast and very young. He comes back more mature than his peers, and finds trouble relating to a lot of the things that they're experiencing, what they value. You know, he really doesn't care what happened at State last week in the football game. You know, he's got more important things on his mind, and so that's what I took out of a piece of fiction, like Mitch. It's sometimes truer than factual. So, and I will be followed by.
Bruce Bannon.
I'm so sorry, I blanked.
Wow! I'm a little dazzled and dazed by all of that. Well, first I want to thank Eva for inviting me to this extraordinary event. I think I'm a person here with absolutely no relationship to the military. I can say that my husband was in Vietnam. My uncle was in World War II. And that's what I know. I thought that I would start by reading a poem by Louise Gluck, because I'm at the end, and this is a poem that deals with the end of war. And then what I'm going to read is also related to the end of the war, If I can keep my papers straight. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm told I have a very soft voice. Parable of the Hostages by Louise Gluck. The Greeks are sitting on the beach, wondering what to do when the war ends. No one wants to go home, back to that bony island. Everyone wants a little more of what there is in Troy, more life on the edge, that sense of every day as being packed with surprises. But how to explain this to the ones at home, whom fighting a war is a plausible excuse for absence, whereas exploring one's capacity for diversion is not? Well, this can be faced later. These are men of action, ready to leave insight to women and children. Thinking things over in the hot sun, pleased by a new strength in their forearms, which seems more golden than they did at home. Some begin to miss their families a little, to miss their wives, to want to see if the war has aged them. And a few grow slightly uneasy. What if war is just a male version of dressing up, a game devised to avoid profound spiritual questions? But it wasn't only the war. The world had begun calling them, an opera beginning with the war's loud chords and ending with the floating aria of the sirens. There on the beach, discussing the various timetables for getting home, no one believed it could take 10 years to get back to Ithaca. No one foresaw that decade of insoluble dilemmas. Oh, unanswerable affliction of the human heart. How to divide the world's beauty into acceptable and unacceptable love. On the shores of Troy, how could the Greeks know they were hostages already, who once delays the journey is already enthralled? How could they know that of their small number, some would be held forever by the dreams of pleasure, some by sleep, some by music? Oh, the rest of this is mine. I'm going to read from a memoir that I have completed that will be published in January of 2027. And the memoir is about my growing up on the grounds of a mental hospital in upstate New York. My mother was a refugee and a psychiatrist, and most of the doctors on the hospital were also refugees. The chapter I'm going to read comes from much later in the book. It takes place at Bard College, where I went, mainly at Bard College, but the beginning is me at home on the hospital grounds with my mother during a field period at Bard, which at that time was a 6-week period when you were supposed to do something meaningful. There's some things you need to know here. Livia is my cousin. Tommy, Alice, and Lolly are my uncles and aunt. Broadmoor is the hospital building where we first lived, and then we moved across the street to a cottage, which was mentioned. And Pauline is the patient who was our housekeeper. So those are the people you need to know. And this begins with my mother, because much of the book has to do with my relationship to my refugee mother, but it goes towards war, so hang on, there is war in this. Maybe a slightly different perspective than what we have heard so far. Chapter is called War and Peace. It's chapter 24 of the book. When I think of my mother, I remember with joy her many endearing and sometimes quirky qualities. I go first to her love of coffee and rye bread and sweet butter. I recall her almost childlike devotion to Christmas trees and all the family rituals that gathered around them. I reflect on her passionate attention to everyone in the family and her tender care of me during my many illnesses and surgeries. She had a love of beauty and could tease brilliant color from slivered African violet leaves, lining window ledges with small pots of thriving plants. She loved wildflowers and all the bunnies and raccoons and deer that roamed freely on the hospital grounds. She maintained her loyalty to Huntley Brinkley and the Sunday New York Times. Her favorite book, which I have still never read, was War and Peace. I did try reading it a number of times, but each time the names, patronymic and diminutive, overwhelmed me. She who could glide from one language to another as easily as she could slide from one pair of elegant shoes to another, observed kindly and patiently when I described my struggle. Yes, those names are hard to keep track of. No matter what tensions there were between us, I always loved being near her. So at the end of my first semester at Bard, I was in no way unhappy to stay on the Hill with her during what Bard called field period, a 6 weeks interregnum during which we were supposed to get a job or travel in order to have some experience of the real world, or alternatively, define a study project and complete that. Since I had no idea how to enter the real world, I decided on a project. The project was helped along by the fact that I had slipped and broken my elbow visiting Livia in Vermont. With my arm in a cast, I had no choice but to stay at home. I chose on a somewhat random basis to read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, a book almost as terrifyingly long as War and Peace.
Yes.
I began with some trepidation, but was soon charmed. Its mid-European world so resembled the world my family lived in. Hans Castorp's visit to his cousin at the Swiss sanatorium made me think predictably of my own home, a hospital. We lived on top of a hill in what had once been a pest house, shelter for the mental patients with communicable diseases, much like tuberculosis. As I settled in, I registered the icy winter. That winter, it seemed to snow every day, making confinement even more appealing. During the day, when my mother worked at Fairmont, the children's unit she was in charge of, and Pauline occupied the kitchen, I hid in my right-angled room while Hans Castorp extended his visit to his cousin further and further until Hans too was declared ill and had no choice but to stay on the mountain. I walked from my bed to the window facing Broadmoor and watched the snow fall. It continued to snow as I tried to parse the long conversations between Nafta and Settembrini, conversations I barely understood. I could tell that Settembrini was a kinder figure, and I liked that he was Italian. My family loved Italy, and somehow that love, if nothing else, inclined me towards Settembrini. When I got to the chapter called Snow, I felt that I was living inside that chapter, and that everything in my life, the broken elbow, the confinement, the frequent snowfall, the blurred sense of reality, was intensifying the fusion between reality and fiction. I was inside the novel, and it was inside me. The snow fell, and I read, life blurred, and so did time. I began to experience time as tricky and inconsistent. I thought I would never finish the novel, and that like Hans Castorp, I would stay on the hill forever. Bard seemed far away. At night, my mother and I watched the nightly news, as we always had. The news now ended with body counts from the escalating war in Vietnam. My mother cradled the cups of coffee that Pauline brought her. We remained largely silent as we watched. Clear that the numbers were fictional, designed to make us think that we were winning the war. Brinkley's ironic rehearsal of those facts and his direct attacks on the stupidity of the war made it clear that we were being lied to by the government. Brinkley was not afraid to call the war pointless. After the news, we ate dinner made for us by Pauline. As we ate, we talked, as we always had. It's awful, I said, the war, I mean. War is awful, my mother said. One night she announced, I'm a pacifist. She continued, I would never fight in a war. I cannot stand violence of any kind. Her assertion suggested implications beyond war. She was telling me about herself, about what she most feared. I pushed her a little as I pushed away my plate. You mean that there is no situation, not any, in which you would become violent? No, she said, standing her ground. I pressed on. Not even if someone tried to harm you? Would you fight then? I would not fight. I would not become violent. There was silence, and then she suddenly shifted her tone. But she continued, if anyone tried to harm you or Tommy or Lolly or Alice, I would kill them. I would not hesitate. The outburst seemed to exhaust her. And then what would happen, I asked quietly. I would suffer the punishment. I would pay any price to keep you safe. And that was that. She had drawn her line in terms that were clear and absolute. There was nothing for us to argue about. Then my sense of time shifted and my life began to move more quickly. I wrote whatever paper I had to write to prove the worth of my field period. My mother packed up the car and drove down the road that led from the hill to the highway and back to Bard. Back at Bard, everything felt different. I was no longer new, and life there felt sweetly familiar. I reunited with Eugenia and other friends. I instantly loved my classes. Certainly the Tom drama, still in its second act, was a constant undercurrent. That's about a boyfriend. But far more urgent was the way the war started to take over campus life, much as it had dominated conversations between me and my mother that winter. Like Hans Castorp, I had tumbled down a hill into a maelstrom of war and confusion. One night, shortly after I returned to Robin's house after dinner, I was summoned to the black telephone that hung on the wall at the far end of my floor. Hello, I asked. I wasn't expecting a call. It was my mother. Hello, Rabbit, she said, using one of her many nicknames for me. Her voice was soft and shaky. Are you okay, I asked, suddenly alert. I needed to make sure she was all right. Yes, she said, just a little shaken up. What happened, I asked. I got the strangest call from Adriana. Adriana was a doctor, was a friend of my mother's, and they had been in medical school together in Italy. I got the strangest call from Adriana, who had a very strange call from John. John was Livia's husband. They were newly married. She continued, John called to ask how long it would take him to bleed to death if he cut off his foot. That's crazy, I said. Why would he cut off his foot? My mother explained that John had decided that this would be his way out of going to Vietnam. He had been assigned A1 status, and that meant he could be called up at any time. The Tet Offensive had started at the end of January, and John and Livia knew he was particularly vulnerable. I don't know what to think or do, my mother said, after she explained the situation. It was as if the draft had suddenly become her problem to solve. I don't think there's anything you can do, I said. Many years later, I learned that John had built a small guillotine in the well-appointed woodshop in the basement of his father's house. The plan was to use the instrument to cut off John's foot and then drive like mad to the nearest hospital to have the bleeding stopped and the wound attended to. But when Livia and John trooped down to the basement to perform their surgery, they both backed away. It was too gory and too painful. As it turned out, John, on a very cold and icy day, drove to the recruitment center in Burlington and persuaded the army doctor that he was gay and so not fit for service. He avoided the draft without any self-harm. That bewildering confrontation with the reality of the war provided a vivid gloss on the changes that had taken place since I had started at Bard in the fall of 1966. In October, a few months earlier, just as the leaves were peaking, Livia and John drove their newly purchased 1927 American LaFrance fire engine to Binghamton on their way back to Vermont. My mother was somewhat perplexed by their arrival because such visits were rare and the fire engine so unusual. So unusual, in fact, that John got a traffic ticket for some small violation, but the situation was so odd and John so charming that the ticket was forgiven and he got a nice write-up in the local newspaper. There was an air of insouciant pleasure about the whole adventure, so different from the somber mood in the country that followed after the year turned, when the war suddenly became a constant presence in our daily lives. When I think of my college years and the war, they merge in my mind. So many events occurred in such rapid succession and with so much public attention and consternation that restating them seems beside the point. There were many deaths and a lot of violence. Most of the time I was a witness, observing what was happening and trying to understand my own assessment of events and actions. But inexorably, because I was so deeply opposed to the war, I was drawn into activism that culminated in 1970 after the Cambodian invasion and the Kent State massacre. Certain events do stand out. A friend who had early on written an article stating that America's longest and deepest tradition was violence, acquired with the help of a friend an army tank. They drove this object across the Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge and explained that doing so was a way of using the enemy's weapons against them. I thought of the picture in Look magazine of the 17-year-old girl holding a chrysanthemum up to a line of soldiers with bayonets. I never saw the tank my friend had acquired, but I witnessed the glee my friend and his accomplice expressed over their prank, and it troubled me. They seemed to be making a joke out of what wasn't funny at all. One day, sometime in the middle of the confusion, a man named Frank Montefia invited me to take a walk with him through the woods near campus. I had no idea what provoked him to suggest this small adventure. He was one of the many in the political circle I was part of, but the only person I knew who had been in Vietnam. Perhaps he was curious about me. Perhaps he noticed that I tended to be quiet and wanted to get to know me. Maybe he was interested in me. I thought of Frank as a man quite different from the boys who were my friends and colleagues and who were the visibly political actors on campus. Frank was older than most of us. He seemed to carry the experience of war with him when he strode slowly across campus. His height and experience were intimidating. He was older and seemed sadder than anyone I knew at Bard. Always hungry for male attention, I was flattered by his invitation and intensely curious. We walked into the woods. It was a late fall day, a bit cool, a bit gray. Dry leaves were scattered across the path. Sometimes we walked side by side. Sometimes he led the way. It was quiet and we exchanged only a few words. I noticed that when I walked, the leaves under my feet crackled and made a sound. His big, booted feet made no noise. He walked as carefully as I imagined he must have walked in the jungles of Vietnam on the trail of something he couldn't see or name. Without anything said, I understood not to ask questions. On that walk, I began to intuit that none of us who were so thoroughly and genuinely engaged in the anti-war effort had any idea what that war was like, or what it meant to be in the middle of it, in the jungle, forced to kill people, and terrified of being killed. Frank carried with him knowledge we did not and could not have. I have no memory of conversation, memory only of the crunch of leaves and a contrasting silence way wider than Frank's broad back. Schooled by that walk, which was never repeated, I grew uncomfortable with rhetoric and noise. There were demonstrations at Fort Dix and other places. One friend ran a draft counseling center on campus. There was a tendency to blame the soldiers, who were, in fact, for the most part, draftees. They were mostly poor or minority kids who had neither the good luck to be in college nor the capacity to imagine their way out by pretending to be gay or crazy or otherwise infirm. I felt sad for them and became more and more certain that I was my pacifist mother's pacifist daughter. Right after I wrote the story of my walk with Frank, I looked him up. He died in 2006 in Mount Tremper in Ulster County, not far from Bard. He was 58 years old. No next of kin was mentioned. The announcement listed no cause of death. Had he killed himself after the pain he had carried so silently for so long? become more than even his broad back could take? Had he become a Buddhist and found his way to the monastery at Mount Tremper, where he accepted that to live is to suffer? Did he die of some ordinary but devastating cancer that cut off his life too soon? I will never know, but I will always wonder. I do know that between John's foot and Frank's camel-covered back, I learned that war is not an abstraction, and that from where I was, safe on a college campus, all I could do was try to bear witness through writing to what was happening around me. Thank you.
Ending to what was a really wonderful range of voices, a wonderful, just exactly the variety of voices and readings that I was hoping to hear. So I just want to say I would love it if you could all sign the Historical Society book at the back. Always good to have, Denise says, you know, as many names as we can, so if you haven't put your name there, please will you do that. And I hope that you'll join us for some drink and refreshment. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, readers.